Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to do another part. We just discussed in the last episode how the magisterium of the Catholic Church rejects God's wrath in a literal sense, and they fully endorse and teach that God's wrath at the cross was metaphorical. And so we need to deal with this problem before we can go on to discuss the theology of the cross, because we need to get a clear understanding about, as we mentioned in the last video, what Scripture teaches and what the magisterium of the church teaches. For anyone who's joining me for this series on this current part, I recommend you go back to part one to get an understanding of the context and what this entire presentation is about. I mean, I've entitled it Contending for the Faith. So go back to part one and try to catch up to whatever part we're up now. Is it part 7? It might be part 7 we're up to right now. So let's move on and let's find out the truth, whether what Rome is teaching about the wrath of God, whether it's literal or metaphorical. We'll test that by the standards of Scripture. Okay, so we need to find literal manifestations of God's wrath in punishing sin for the Old and New Testament. So we're just going to go through a few examples out of Scripture to clarify that God, in fact, is a God of wrath and does punish sin in a literal sense. Okay, in the first example of God's wrath, is obviously the global flood that happens in Genesis 6:8. And the literal reality is the flood is presented as historical judgment with geological evidence, often cited by scholars as aligning with a global deluge. So it's obvious the global flood was literal, according to Scripture and what it teaches. Secondly, the judgment at Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19, verses 24-25. And the literal reality is physical destruction is explicit. The site, modern Dead Sea, shows ash layers and sulfur balls in archaeological studies. Another literal example of God's judgment. Thirdly, Diab and Abahu. Sorry, I don't know the pronunciation of that. But anyway, it's this example of God's wrath is in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. And so the cause of this judgment was that they violated God's holiness through ritual presumption. Let's just keep that at that for now. 5. We'll skip 4 because that's to do with the atonement. We're just doing basic judgment, God's wrath. The exile of Israel and Judah. 2 Kings, chapter 17, verse 18, chapter 24, verses 3 and 4. The literal realities by historical records, e.g. Babylonian chronicles, confirm these events as divine punishment. Once again, God shows his wrath, his anger on sin as a literal reality. Now, we're going to get to some of the good stuff. This was Old Testament. Obviously, these are some quite famous examples and better known examples of what the Lord has done, how he's made judgment on those who have obviously disobeyed him. Let's go to the New Testament and see how we have to see how God judges wrath in an atoning sense. So obviously, the first one we need to realise is that the first example is Jesus' cry of abandonment. The event happened as described in Matthew 27:46. Christ screamed, quote, unquote, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Unquote. So the theological significance is that the Catholic Church clearly teaches that this was metaphorical, not literal. And then at the same time, by that admission, denying real penal substitution, which is supported by Scripture, Psalms, as the work on the cross had fulfillment, as inscribed in Psalms chapter 22, verse 1. So obviously there's a prophetic statement there. Moving on to the second example of the literal wrath of God is the propitiation in Romans chapter 3, verses 25 to 26, where Christ is, quote unquote, propitiation. The Greek meaning heliosterion, meaning wrath appeasing sacrifice. And the literal effect, if the wrath was metaphorical, as Rome claims, the propitiation would be meaningless, according to Scripture. So there's another example of literal wrath. These last two examples are based on in a tonal sense. Third, the curse bearing of Christ. This as explained in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. For the event happened and it describes Christ, quote unquote, became a curse for us by crucifixion. So the literal fulfillment, in reality, in Deuteronomy 21:23, declares that the hangman, cursed by God, is Jesus' physical death on wood and embodied this curse. So obviously God's wrath was working in a literal sense. Jeez, they've got a huge problem, Rome, a huge problem. But we'll get to that. And the final example of the literal wrath of God in an atonement sense is the final judgment in Revelation 14, 9 to 11, and 20, verses 10 to 15, where unrepentant sinners drink the wine of God's fury and face the lake of fire. So obviously God is saying it, obviously describing as the lake of fire as a literal place. And the literal reality is torment forever and ever, Revelation 20:10, but conscious eternal punishment. Not alienation, but conscious eternal punishment in a literal sense. Whew, that's a lot to take in. So we can see clearly by Scripture standards that God is a God of wrath and has to deal with sin. So what we've got to come to realise by what we've just described, what we've just gone through, is that we need to understand who we need to trust. Do we need to trust the sacred scriptures, the sacred tradition, or the magisterium of the church? And I'll explain that in the next video who we need to trust and why. And by God, Christ, by the scriptures and Christ's words alone, why we need to trust the scripture instead of the magisterium. So I hope to meet you at the next part, and we'll go through all that to clarify before we get to the theology of the cross, which is so important for Catholics out there who want to come to know the Lord. So I'll see you then. Thank you.